Jai Guru, everyone.
Jai Guru. Welcome everybody to the next episode of Awake, the Life of Yogananda podcast. Last week we had an episode with Walter. We were talking about the yugas, and now we are back to the minutes. And it's what minute are we on, Priyank?
28.
28, fantastic. And this time we talked about, so Yogananda, he basically came to America. We talked a lot about him meeting Sri Yukteswar and the meeting of a guru. And now he has all this preparation. He became the Swami, and now he is in the States. He's in Boston, and he's spending.
It's a strange jump, wasn't it? It was like he was. They were in. He was in the ashram. He was describing uprooting every thing out of all that stuff, and then they just suddenly jumped. So it's like that artistic license, because we've already had like him landing in US I don't know how many minutes ago, and then this has now gone back and then back again.
Yeah, they intertwine those two stories and they jump back and forth a little bit in the movie.
Yeah. What did you think about that? Reviewing it as we're analyzing it, it makes it very difficult, to be honest, because it doesn't follow like a set chronological order. We have to go back and forth.
I see what they're doing, because I feel like the two things, they make sense in combination. So he gets prepared for America, and then they show how his preparedness pays off once he is there. Once he goes to Boston, you kind of see him doing this one talk. And I'm not sure what his plan was. When he went to Boston, did he think, I will stay there now in America for the next 15 years? Was that the idea? Because he basically goes under the pretense that he will speak at this Congress of religious liberals and then possibly go back. I mean, he got a big check from his dad, which allowed him to stay a bit longer. But staying for that long, that kind of is something that probably happened over the time, or I'm sure it was a divine plan all along anyways. What do you think about that, Chris?
Yeah, I'd agree. I guess looking at who Yogananda is, he's going to have some kind of foresight, isn't he, as to his endeavors there. I think although somewhat reluctantly, he wanted to stay in India and do his practices there. He had visions and so on and so forth that I think we can get into. There's some nice quotes in there, but in the autobiography. So he could see a life that was going to be quite established for himself there. But in terms of how they cover it, it's not easy, is it? It's, you're talking about quite an in-depth, complex story of events that need to be kind of explained before they're kind of laid out fully. So, I don't mind it too much, but I think for us, it's going to be different knowing a lot more about the story than it is about somebody watching that for the first time. So I think some artistic license in there. But, yeah, for us covering it, obviously we've had a chat just before this call. So do we go into detail on this first, or do we break this up so it is a little bit more tricky? But it's all good.
I totally agree. Oh yeah, go Priyank.
Just a one big quick comment. This section we're talking about him being in Boston. So it's on page 407 of the autobiography of Yogi, of which it's a 600 or just shy of a 600-page book. So 2/3 of the way in, and he literally he talks about being in Boston, and then he says, okay, and then in 1924, then I went to LA, and then in 1925 I was in LA. So literally in 2 paragraphs, 4 years have just passed, and that is where I think we should focus some of our efforts. And really, it's really good because a movie fills in that gap, doesn't it? Of his time in, firstly when he landed in Boston, and now it talks about some of his lecture tours and things like that. So we'll talk about that, I suppose, Mike.
I see what you mean, and that's a really good point that he put so little emphasis on Boston in the book. I feel like it's also because he was exploring the United States a little bit, and Boston was geographically back then people didn't fly. Today you can probably jump on an airplane in Delhi and get out in LA and all good, right? But back in the day, you went to Boston, and his message was to be spread in the West, right? So it might as well have been Boston, right? And so he did learn some valuable lessons of how to spread a message in America as opposed to India, which is quite different, I would say, right? In India, you probably had this very receptive audience that are used to going to a spiritual leader, to a guru. He would talk about self and life energy maybe, and those kind of things. And that is vocabulary that they all have. And now he goes to America, and it's a more materialistic, capitalistic society where it's all about being successful and famous. And now he has to go in there and spread his message. And he's not the one who goes there to say, oh, I use my Indian ways and they just have to follow me. He adapts his ways to the West to an extent. What do you think? Let me throw one more thing in there. They show a beautiful picture of him standing next to a huge billboard where it says free lectures by Swami Yogananda. And I believe the word life force control is in there, which is, I would say, a marketing term for his teachings. What do you think about that, Priyank?
Yes, that's a very interesting point you raised there. So looking at that poster, he's had to obviously attract people to coming to his lectures in Boston and also New York, because he jumped between the two, and he established two areas, two sanghas actually, one in Boston, one in New York City. And he also went to Philadelphia as well. So these are the kind of posters he put. So he's like just reading it. He says, like, he calls himself a renowned lecturer, an educator, and psychologist from India. Concentration and life force is the topic. So I did a quick search on Google and the use of words like life force, and it's quite interesting because up till 1940, I'd say, it was very little used in literature and newspaper and all those kind of things. And then it spikes. So we see, I think what we see here is Yogananda tapping into something that's language that's probably ahead of his time. And then obviously it strikes a chord in the hearts and minds of the good people of the United States of America. And then it starts shooting up. And we use the life force quite often, and people without any knowledge of Hinduism and that kind of stuff kind of can describe what life force might be, can't they? And obviously Yogananda uses it quite often.
Absolutely. Yes. I feel like the kind of, he was a total trailblazer, and I can only imagine how that was in his time. What do you think about that, Chris?
I was just thinking, when did the Star Wars movies come out? Because it probably would have life force, really hit home for the majority of people in the Western world after that. No, I think you guys, like what you're saying is pretty spot on. We can't really take it out of context too much, and we should look at the fact Yogananda had a long trip to get to the United States in the first place, not knowing the language. And he probably spent a few years really settling in, finding his feet in a sense. There's a quote here in the autobiography of a yogi. As you mentioned, Mike, due to his father's generous check, he was able to remain in America after the Congress was over for 4 happy years. And he spent that in humble circumstances in Boston. And he gave public lectures, taught classes. He wrote a book of poems, The Songs of the Soul. And I guess that's him really teeing himself up for what's to come, becoming familiarized with what exactly the American public are looking for and how he can best reach them. So yeah, he's probably doing his research, so to speak, over the 4 years.
Just with respect to what you just said about living in humble circumstances, he also doesn't in the biography of Yogananda that Mr. Goldberg writes, he's written, despite some successes, he said in a speech, Yogananda said in a speech 20 years later, I experienced troubles of every kind and went through periods of greatest poverty. When we hadn't enough to buy food, we would fast for a few days. And then one day, it was in 1924, I knelt down and asked God and the masters, why have you brought me to America? I felt that I was not fully accomplishing my mission, and I asked for their guidance. The answer came, and then a vision in which I saw myself in LA. So obviously so it was very, very difficult. He doesn't mention this, but he went through some pretty difficult financial struggles in that time, in terms of food, even, it would appear.
Yeah, and I think there's some notable followers in Boston, like Dr. Lewis's, and I believe he stayed with them for a while at least. I think they lived in I went to Somerville, Massachusetts, a few years back, and I think they had a house on, it was called Electric Avenue, and he stayed in a small room in the attic or something for some time. And one of the things that I remember is he came back to Boston many years later, and then the Lewises, back then the financial situation had completely changed, and they wanted to host him in a very luxurious way, as opposed to the way that he was staying in when he first came. And I guess that's kind of to do with the memories he made in the beginning.
You know, we're talking a lot about time here, aren't we? You know, he spent 4 years here. You know, he arrived in 1920, and I suppose that in its most simplest form is maybe the reason why, you know, he's spent 4 years. Maybe the timing wasn't quite right, and that he did need to make these connections in Boston to enable what actually unfolded in Los Angeles, which is obviously how it happened. Really, he says himself that it was with the help of large-hearted students. By the end of 1925, he established the headquarters in LA. So yeah, timing is everything. And I suppose we don't really know how the dots are connected until we kind of look back right on our lives. So yeah, Yogananda is obviously showing us how it's done and doing his atonement in the interim. To
bring his point home a little bit, how different Boston was for him and how a bit lost he felt. I like how in the movie they show this scene of Boston. I think you see some people walking across a railway track, and then you see a streetcar going through the inner city. And I'm not sure, this must have been quite a different pace of life in Boston than what he was used to. And he got kind of eased into the American lifestyle in Boston, I guess. There is a quote here, Priyank, about a letter that Yogananda wrote to Dr. Lewis.
Read it.
You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, why don't you read that? Because this also highlights we don't want to focus too much about money, but it highlights the struggles and how Yogananda managed those struggles. So we talked about previously about food, and they used to fast, but this letter here talks a little bit about management and his style. So Mike, do you want to read that? The highlighted
Sure.
part?
A letter Yogananda wrote to Dr. Lewis on January 7th reveals a managerial attention to detail that would shock most sannyasis. After thanking the doctor for a monetary contribution and a promised loan to further the work, he seeks clarity in the weeds. I think you are right in your suggestion of printing 3,000 Yogoda, but I want to know right away how long it will take to print 3,000 and whether $165 would be taken from $800 plus $500 or $1,300 or $300 plus $200 already deposited in my bank. He also asks about interest rates and terms of payment, and concludes typically on a motivational note, saying he is pleased with how things have gone in Boston and imploring him to move forward. Oh, wow. So it's like he's very much on top of the monetary situation there, and he cares a lot of how the money is spent.
The minutest detail, it would appear, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, so I thought that was really interesting because he wouldn't have had a secretary, would he? Like we obviously, when he was in LA and Mother Center was there, we had he would have had hundreds of volunteers, and one of them would have been an accountant, but he had to play the role as guru accountant. secretary, all the, bank clerk, for, going to the bank, writing checks, withdrawing money, all that's just errands just himself would have had to have done.
Was he accompanied at this point by Dhirananda already, or would he?
Yeah, so
would
he
drop
came
in occasionally? How did that work?
Yeah, so Dhirananda came at about this time to at Yogananda's request to come and help. So in fact, in some talks, Dhirananda would actually Swami Dhirananda would actually give some of the talks. So he would actually join him on the stage, and in fact, if Yogananda was away, he would instruct Swami Dhirananda to lead a sangha or even lead a talk himself, which is interesting.
Nice.
This kind of makes me, we're talking about the kind of the humble situations that he found himself in Boston. Put it into context and spiritualize it a little bit. We're talking about an avatar, somebody who's immensely gifted and spiritually superior, and to him, I suppose, we were talking about the yugas previously, coming out of the Kali Yuga into Dwapara Yuga. This is somebody who's extremely enlightened. This must seem very clunky and slow, and I wonder what it would have been in Satya Yugas. Like, no money would have been actually needed because things might be done in a different way. It just seems like it's not beneath him, but very, very, very mundane for somebody of his stature to really have to do. But there was a great quote I've read just before this call on the autobiography of a yogi saint from Sri Yukteswar, indicating that he shouldn't use his powers to peer into others' minds and see what's going on in people's thoughts, because even God doesn't do that, is what Sri Yukteswar says. And the influence that he would be able to have over the common man would be quite immense if he has these kind of powers. So for him to go in and really grind out these details is all the more impressive and gives great discipline and dedication to the cause, doesn't it? So yeah, he's just obviously playing the game that we all have to play, and he does it so well. So
absolutely. I think that's what all the avatars do, right? They kind of played a role in their time, just like Jesus must have thought similar things, right? When he was in the Kali Yuga, he was like, oh God, they don't even have a ship. Like, at least Yogananda in the future, he will be able to take a ship to America. I'm gonna walk to India by horse cart or something. Like, I don't know how he got there. No. All right, so he is in Boston. He does lecture tours, and he focuses, in the beginning at least, he focuses more on the East Coast, as you said, Priyanka. He focuses on New York and Philadelphia, like the Northeast corridor, and he spreads his message, and he tries to mix that message a little bit with like what people want to hear, with like, or in terms of how do you improve your business, how do you become a better manager, those kind of things. And we have some quotes out here. Do you want to kick us off on one of them? Yeah,
so he obviously had to talk about that. For example, he talked about things like this is in the biography of by Phil Goldberg. He says things like, I intend to live forever and with everlasting youth and infinite energy, and that's the kind of thing that obviously everyone, especially businessmen that are in their 60s and 70s, that's what they want to hear, isn't it? But also businessmen in their 60s and 70s would not have been able to sit in a slightly tangential topic, would not have been able to sit in a cross-legged full lotus position to meditate. And I wanted to touch on that. So we talked about the language that that Yogananda used, and he used words like life force and medulla oblongata and all those things, and he linked that to the chakras, and so he linked like physiology to Eastern sciences. But he also had to, as I mentioned, like Westerners aren't used to sitting on the floor. So you had to, but in India, when you meditate, this is the asana that you use to meditate is defined. You have to sit on the floor. This is how you sit. The spine is like this, etc. And so Yogananda, I think, probably pioneered, and he was, from my research, he was the first to actually suggest that you can, as long as your spine is straight, then you can sit in a chair. And similarly, the diksha, or the initiation process, is always like a guru disciple is a close knit community, close bond. And I think, and Mas Vidal and Varun Soni, I think, talked about this, how like Yogananda in some circles, even now, is seen as like, oh, he's going too much away from, you know, the culture and the traditions of the guru disciple relationship. Like, for example, we have lessons by airmail, and lots of these students would rarely even have the opportunity to meet Yogananda, even in those days. So there's lots of discussions about, and scholars debate how much liberty Yogananda has taken in that respect. I don't know, what do you guys feel about that?
I think
he's liberating the masses, so he has to take a liberty to do it, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Mike.
I would agree with what you just said, Chris. I do think there is, in the autobiography, the discussion between Lahiri Mahashaya and Babaji, how he has to adapt the way of teaching to the age, to the Dwapara Yuga. He mentions a few times that in the descending age, Kriya Yoga got lost because of the secrecy of the priests, and they want to have a more of an open approach. And I feel like the lessons, they come from that. I don't know exactly the quote that Lahiri Mahashaya used, but he basically wanted to give yoga to all sincere seekers. I think that was kind of the caveat he threw in there. So, and since once you're a sincere seeker, why not have it as a written in written form at home? You could also, like what Priyank just did, I feel like, interpret it as meeting the West halfway, I guess, because you just use their means a bit. But I'm not sure if that's really the case, because there was just this material abundance in America at the time, and basically, if back then India would have been in a better shape economically, they would probably also had all of those things, and maybe they would have made the same decisions. Maybe not sitting on a chair. Sitting on a chair, that's like a cultural thing, I guess.
I must say, I'm so glad that he allowed it, because even for me to sit for an hour on the floor, my leg is dead. My ankle feels like it's going to explode, even for me. And I've been doing it since I was a child, so I can't imagine some of you guys doing that.
I remember each time I went to India, there was when I went to meditation group there, most of the times there weren't any chairs, and then luckily sometimes they had cushions, because that's kind of what makes it easier for me. But then also sometimes they meditate on a stone floor for like hours with just a cushion, and I'm like, that's basically how you lose the body consciousness. That's how you go.
Yeah. You can't think about the body anymore because it's too painful. But you touch on a good point, Mike, about the yugas again, and it's our favorite subject now, I think. It mightn't simply have been possible to do this because of the, let's say, resistance in the prevailing consciousness of mankind. You know, he was coming in the 1920s and doing these things, and the Kali Yuga would have really just finished in the cosmic scale. So he's really just coming in to implement this in a timely fashion, isn't he? So it's, you know, you can stick to the old-fashioned ways of years gone by, but you're talking about lesser times. This was more recently in the Kali Yuga. So it's really just natural progression, is it not? You know, when we look at the cosmic scale.
Absolutely. As we learned in our last episode, there isn't just the yugas, there's also the sandhis, right? And so if you go, it kind of works quite well. So if you say in the year 1700 that Dwapara Yuga started, and then you add 150-year Sandhi on top of it, you're like 1850. And when did Sri Yukteswar get Kriya Yoga? Was it 1860s, something like that? So pretty timely after the Sandhi ended. Kriya Yoga was given to the masses. Yes.
They incarnate at this time to do what they're doing, you know, to break through the times. Just as Jesus was talking about, you know, there's going to be a time when we're moving into a different era, a different age, and you know, you've got Yogananda coming to execute on that quite nicely. So, yeah.
Nice.
Chapter close.
All right.
One more thing before we move on. So the other thing that Phil Goldberg also says in his biography is that Yogananda really used this time to define and experiment with what works with the audience. So obviously he did this whole tour of, you know, lectures, and then he explored topics that people are into, but also the establishment of, you know, the lessons and things like that. So for example, he says the pattern Yogananda had established in Boston continued in New York. So in Boston, he says there was 3 public lecture tours, and then they were followed by a series of classes, 12 if later courses are a guide, and then that's $25. And then that is how much in today's money? $350 in today's money. So then apparently the title of the talks would be just things like the tangible cosmic consciousness, the power of will, death and immortality, and during Easter things like spiritual baptism. So so it's interesting that this is the time that he used to establish what later then became the formal lessons that we sign up for now, and now we can get them on our iPads and phones. And this is where they were born, I suppose. And it was unique, isn't it? Mas Vidal was saying that this method of distributing lessons was like completely new and revolutionary, didn't he? He said that, he told us that in the thing. I'm not sure if he did that yet, but that's obviously where he would have experimented, especially liaising with students in distant cities.
Yeah, the Western world and in the US infamously used the plane to stick an atomic bomb in it and dropped it, whereas Yogananda is using the plane to stick, you know, beautiful lessons of spirituality and
dropping different types of bombs.
Dropping spiritual bombs, isn't he?
He was dropping spiritual bombs. Yeah. And then, not sure if I like that metaphor, but let's stick with it. He then
rewired the thinking.
He then continued on dropping those spiritual bombs all over the country, and went on lecture tours that were not just the Northeast, but he basically toured the country. And you see some beautiful images in the movie. Then you see one image where he was sitting by a lake, and then there's this famous picture where like a little bear cub comes up to his car. I believe this is Yosemite National Park, and he looks back into the camera. It's an epic shot. What do you guys think?
Absolutely epic. Really epic. Yeah, everyone loves bears as well, so this is like a baby bear, so like it doesn't get much better, does it? And Yogananda is in his turban, and I love shots where Yogananda is in his turban. I think they've got a completely different feel to them.
He almost looks at home, doesn't he? And he's looking back with that twinkle in his eye, you know, and he's in harmony with this little cub. Probably reminding him of more of the nature that he had back in India. Feels like
we would metaphorically, we are that cub, you know, trying to latch onto that car that he's on, and Yogananda's kind of stopped, and he's like, yeah, you know, hop on board, I'll take
me with you.
The fastest way out of Yosemite. Yeah.
And then you hear in the movie, it continues with Chitananda making this remark that he says that he hasn't found the right place yet. So his message was received in Boston, but it wasn't taking off in the way that he imagined it to. And he figured out that it was because he wasn't in the right place. And then where does he go, Priyank?
So he apparently decided, as you mentioned, he wanted to go to LA, but he decided to go on a road trip. So during that road trip, he went and talked at various places. But very interesting to note, and I don't know if it come up later in the movie, but very important character in the history of Self-Realization Fellowship, a chap called Mohammad Rashid. And you won't know anything about him, I imagine, but he's an Indian man who was on board with him in the city of Sparta. No doubt he would have been a Muslim with that name. So he's in this time in Boston and New York City, that he managed to keep in contact with this chap. And Muhammad basically agreed to be his coordinator and just general secretary. And he accompanied Yogananda with on this road trip to LA and doing all these tours. And he would Phil Goldberg describes that Mohammad Rashid would go ahead of the group that Yogananda's with, and Yogananda was with two other Americans, and obviously going through the Central American states at that time would have been quite an experience, not just in terms of the raw beauty, but also the amount of racism and other things that he would have experienced, because this was at the height of Ku Klux Klan time, that was still very big at that time. So perhaps those Western or white people were kind of acting as security guards. I don't know, but Muhammad would go ahead of the party and plan these things, and then Yogananda would get there and everything's all planned for him, very nice and proper. And interestingly, it says that the preferred accommodation for them during this road trip was camping. So they would have stopped in some remote places, and no doubt that also would have been financially the reason why it would have made more sense for them to camp as opposed to stay in expensive hotels. I'm sure cheap motels weren't a thing. Motel 666 or whatever, it wasn't a thing back then.
It's interesting that you mentioned the racism part, because I'm not sure if you ever seen the movie The Green Book, but it's basically a movie about a jazz pianist from New York who became quite famous. It's based on a real story, and then he does a tour of the South. And back then there was complete segregation in the South. So the Green Book was basically a guide where people of color were allowed to stay, because they were not allowed to stay in regular motels. And this is that same time in which Yogananda toured the country. So you can imagine maybe camping was just the best choice.
Interesting. Yeah,
regardless.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, so not just expense then, just actually being able to stay.
Yeah, those were very different times. I love about Yogananda that he hardly describes the hardships he went through to give us those teachings and establish this.
He just went from one paragraph in Boston to another in LA, and then in a couple of paragraphs later it said, he established Mount Washington. But we're going to go through that in next minute, how that exactly came about, because it's quite a journey, you would say, as it has been, no doubt, for you listeners to have gone through this minute up to now that we've gone through.
Yes, and is it picture time? Can we go through some of the pictures that they showed about?
Why not?
We're not going to talk that much about him being in LA. That will be in the next episode. But they show some interesting pictures about what California was like at the time. The first one is the famous Hollywood sign, but it says Hollywood Land. What did you think about that, Chris, when you saw that?
Well, I know we talked about this briefly before, didn't we? The Hollywood Land, we know it as Hollywood. So you guys maybe know a little bit more about this, Mike, than I do. But I just know the Hollywood is supposedly connections to the Hollywood tree, and there's, whether it's just a conspiratorial thing or not, I have no idea. Feel free to correct me on this. But the Hollywood tree was used to carve out wands or something back in the Druid days in Europe, and yeah, I don't know if that's connected to Hollywood at all, but there's the spell that Hollywood casts over us to kind of mesmerize us to watching
Chris,
amazing movies.
I knew you were a tree hugger, but I didn't think you were a pagan witchcraft wizardry person as well.
I'm Celtic. I'm Celtic. So the Druids clearly have some connection to my blood.
Chris's school of witchcraft and wizardry.
Exactly.
I didn't know anything about that. I need to research that now. I didn't even know there was a Hollywood tree.
That's probably better things to research, I guess, than that. But that's the only thing I know. But yeah, you maybe know more about the Hollywood land than I do, Mike.
I'm intrigued now.
Interestingly, I was at a vegan festival recently, and then there's this tree called I think Palo Santo in Ecuador, and they use this tree. They use oil from this tree, and it's supposed to be really good for healing and stuff like that. So no doubt there's back in the day we were much more in tune with use of natural resources for herbal remedies and everything, and that's been lost through the ages. That knowledge. We're just going to keep quoting that. Thank God we've done the Yuga episode now. We can just keep saying, go back to the episode now for more information on lost civilizations.
That's good. I mean, I'm always a bit skeptical when I hear those. I mean, I believe in natural remedies, but I also believe that the kind of medieval time remedies, they were usually not really remedies. So the level of knowledge was very limited back then. So I wouldn't count on it being.
I don't know. I'm talking much longer back, because like the Native American Indians, how long have they been in the Americas for? Thousands of years, no doubt. Perhaps from the previous Yuga.
Yeah, maybe. Well, Yogananda talks about being healed just by looking at a picture of Lahiri Mahashaya. So, what's possible? Is it the input or the output? Is it the taking the picture of Sri Yukteswar or Lahiri Mahashaya, sorry, and really believing, really having faith that they are there in spirit with you? Then is it your input of what you put into the things, or if we can manifest our own realities, the placebo effect, is that what really amplifies these things or not? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, Sri Yukteswar, I think it's in the Holy Science where he talks about this civilization where their healthcare is basically all done through diets, and the only medication they use are ointments, right? And I feel like this is kind of where we should be heading. Enable the body to heal itself, but I think we're getting massively sidetracked here from
from the Hollywood land. This is a good tangent compared to where we could have gone, which is like celebrities and all that rubbish.
Oh yeah. That's not us, man. We're not the TMZ crowd here. We're more like the alternative healing people.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think the Hollywood land is just back then that was the letters that were there, and they were renovated a few times and rearranged and everything, and at some point when they redid them, they just left the land out because actually the town was called Hollywood, and that kind of made sense. And it's cool that it's still there even today. It's like a real landmark, and there's like a hiking trail up there, so you can actually go there really near to the letters and take a selfie. Or
was it Chris?
like
I think Mike, you were telling me that they've like boarded it off. Was it you? They've like really fenced it off, and like if you
it was vandalized a few times.
My cousin was telling me. So like when they were kids, when he lives near the sign, and when they were kids, they would go on, climb the fence and like sit on the sign and stuff. And apparently, like it's really serious. Like police helicopters come and stuff like that when you do that.
The times have changed. Yep, then we have a few more pictures. So the next one is a bunch of oil rigs. And I think that kind of points to one of the reasons why California became so big, because of petroleum that was found in the area. And even today, like a few miles from here, there's a mall in Beverly Hills. And when you go down to the parking garage, you see oil rigs pumping there still even today. Mm-hmm. So we're like sitting on oil fields. Like if you go down to Orange County or Santa Barbara, you look at the ocean, you see oil platforms. Like this is like still big business here, maybe not as big as it used to be. But I can imagine back in those days, that was the time when big money came into California, and a lot of jobs were created in the petroleum industry, and that was probably one of the reasons why it grew next to the movie business.
Yeah, I wonder what Yogananda thought about all the, the hustle and bustle about the industrial age. I wonder if he kind of foresaw the damage that it was going to do to the planet. I don't have any reference to this, but there was obviously a lot of advancement at that time. Maybe he did know a little bit about it. Like this is a phase that humanity goes through, and then they kind of shake it off before they realize greater potentials. But it would be interesting to know.
Yeah, I would agree with what you just said, that he would basically go unattached through this, like saying it is a phase. I mean, I'm sure the ship he was on was probably a ship that went on oil or on coal or whatever, and that was just how it was back in the day. I don't think he ever complained about, like, that's not something he does, right? He doesn't complain like, oh, this is such a low age, look what we're doing. And yeah. He just he was always on the side of progress, and I think if he was there today, he would still be, right? He would still say, okay, this is the old, this is the new, and more in a context of this is kind of how this world works. It keeps moving into one direction.
Maybe that's why I mentioned so little about Boston, because he didn't want to complain. But he does say that, doesn't he? He says, if you don't have anything good to say, kind of bite your tongue. Better not to say the words than have nasty things kind of come out, right?
Yeah. I think earlier in the movie you hear this where he's in Boston and he reads the sign hot dogs, and then he goes like, oh God, why do you bring me in this country where they eat dogs, right?
That's for comical value though as well, isn't it?
Even he has his limits, right, of what he's willing to accept.
Well, thankfully he didn't get sent to China then. It would have actually been parts of China. Would have been true, unfortunately.
And then we have one last picture, which is, I can clearly identify Charlie Chaplin on there. I would say maybe Greta Gabor in the middle, and I don't know who the third chap is, but this kind of points at the movie business, and there is some of those people who are famous in Hollywood later become his disciples and maybe also help him spread the message. Do you guys know much about this? Of course, we sometimes talk about George Harrison and people like that. But I think Elvis Presley came to Mother Center a few times, even though he was a bit later. I'm not sure if you guys know too much about this kind of celebrity connections that he had at this time.
Not so much at that time. Was it us that we were talking about Elvis Presley really desperately wanting Korea? Was it on the podcast that we were talking about that he actually went in with somebody else and offered a large sum of money to be initiated into Korea, and Sri Dharma said no, it wasn't going to happen no matter how much money was involved. And it just kind of struck a chord with me there, like, wow, I guess in Hollywood, with the nature of, the fast-paced nature of the place, people would have been looking for shortcuts, like maybe Elvis and others. So there would have been a lot of kind of delicate management in there as well. But that's all I know. I know there's obviously one or two key people, but I'm sure he probably would have been discretionary about it.
I know who his first celebrity disciple was. His first, according to Phil Goldberg, not that opera singer, but this other. Well, according to Phil Goldberg, part of when he was in Philadelphia, he was giving the talk, and in his first lecture, the large public library, the Philadelphia orchestra conductor Leopold Stokowski was there, and apparently Phil Goldberg says that the maestro is Yogananda's first celebrity devotee. Conductors of major orchestras having something akin to rock star status in those days. And apparently in 1924 print run of the Yogoda booklet, it has this blurb from Stokowski beneath one of Alvin Hunziker, the president of the Standard Textile Products. And he says, music is vibration and all life is vibration. Yogananda has profound knowledge of this and of concentration and of charging the body with vitality. I have learned much from him.
Nice.
So that was his impression from celebrities, I suppose, back in the day.
Yeah, I feel like there's always this kind of connection. Like when you have this earthly success, then a lot of the things you feel like that should have been manifested, like you are successful, you have money, now you think you are entitled to eternal happiness, and it's not there, then a lot of those become seekers then. I feel like there is something like that happening to a lot of people who come to fame and then try to manage it like that. Even today.
Well, there's a story, was it Priyank? You saw somebody famous in the London Centre, didn't you? So I don't know if you said the names, but there's obviously seekers, right? And people seeking the truth. You don't remember?
I can't remember that. Who are you referring to? I'm sure
he's a very famous comedian.
Oh.
London comedian. Russell Brand.
Oh, was he there? Okay.
Yeah, and I think you said you kind of went up and spoke to him, and he was like, "Look, just don't tell people I'm here. I don't want people knowing." And it must be difficult for, on the other side of things, for famous celebrities who you would recognize in the street.
Brian clearly wasn't that interested.
I don't
he already forgot.
Chris, I don't think that was me. That must have been Priyanka, perhaps.
Maybe, yeah. I need to rummage the memory back.
But I think I recall someone telling me that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it might not be me.
But he did leave a lasting impression on Priyank.
You know what would be really crazy right now? Like if like in a few weeks I see Russell Brand in there, and then like I think that I actually have to say this to someone. So Chris, you were foreseeing the future.
Foreseeing the future. Yeah, I'd like to say so, but it's definitely me just getting mixed up.
I can see Russell Brand walking up to Priyank and say, "Hey Priyank, do you remember me?" And Priyank was like, "Who are you?"
Yeah, should we tag him in this episode? So if we can get him on the show.
That'd be amazing.
He is very open to spirituality and kind of breaking new ground for so many people who aren't open to spirituality, but they have such personas that they need to maintain. It must be quite delicate for them to get involved, especially at that time, with something like this. With talking about life-trons and life force and the nature of God being in your spine and these kind of things. Even in this day and age, I talk to certain members of my family. They might think I'm crazy with the stuff that I'm kind of saying, look, these are the teachings and this is why I do what I do. But back then, you're talking about nearly 100 years. It would have been potentially how would you call it? Career suicide for some of these people to be involved in these circles. So fair play to anybody who did get involved and who is getting involved, who is in the public eye, because they come under a lot more scrutiny than what we do. So.
Yeah, I listen to his podcast sometimes. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah,
the guests he has on and himself as well. Like his life has taken quite a turn, and I think that's pretty good.
Yeah, he shares my left-wing ideals, and he's very left-wing, so it's quite interesting to see how he articulates.
It's a big coming out now. Okay.
We'll talk after.
Yeah. In our new political podcast.
We don't want to lose our listeners, Yogananda devotee listeners, with left-wing talk.
Well, yeah, I mean, we just talked about the Satya Yuga, and would they even have money in that, and how does that come into political spheres? I would suggest
controversial.
everything's blown out of the water, right? No left, no right. It just is. So
I think this is like something that is also a sign of the time right now. This extreme polarization, and like if someone can just come up and just bring everybody back together again, instead of saying I'm left, I'm right, I'm a human, I want to bring people together, I love everybody. And this kind of healing is kind of what people are waiting for, I feel, at the moment. And yeah, if you guys are those, then maybe you can become famous like that. Yeah. I think this wraps up minute 28. Do you guys have anything to add to the minute still?
Nope.
No, we have, I think, as we mentioned, maybe more of a similar minute coming up next minute, where we're going to talk a little bit more about LA. But there was, I suppose, just some teasers. Yogananda throughout his time with Sri Yukteswar had moments of visions, of seeing images of dwellings that he would have in the future. And there was just a passage in the autobiography of a yogi where the ever, let's say, piercing Sri Yukteswar was looking at Yogananda when he was meditating, and he sort of scolded him to say, "Hey, you're not focusing." And Yogananda was saying, like, "Yes, I'm focusing. And Sri Yukteswar turned around and said, "Well, no, your mind is off, imagining these three distant, or these three homes of yours, sort of thing." And this goes on throughout Yogananda's lifetime. And as you mentioned, Priyanka, earlier on, yes, he did have a vision when he deeply prayed, when he was in Boston, as to why he was there and was he making the right progress. So he was having these visions of places where he would establish spiritual dwellings, and one of them was in LA. So yeah, we can talk more about that in the next minute.
Do you wanna give a quick peek in what building in LA he saw?
You're more familiar with it than myself, or maybe even Priyanka. Like,
would certainly have been Mount Washington, no doubt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he saw Mount Washington. He saw another building in California as well, but we'll talk about this another time.
Okay.
Yes.
Look forward to it.
We
All
will.
right. All right.
So Jai Guru, everyone. See you next time. Jai Guru. Thank you.